Welcome back to The Explainer. Let's jump right in because we have a lot of ground to cover. In part 2, we mapped out exactly how social media acts like a digital slot machine, fundamentally conditioning the brain's mesolimbic reward system. We learned how the constant anticipation of likes and endless scrolling completely hijacks your dopamine pathways. But today, we're looking at the next, and honestly, perhaps more alarming consequence. So what actually happens when your brain is constantly trained by this endless digital novelty? Well, the answer is that it fundamentally begins changing how your brain allocates attention. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today, how these platforms are targeting the very foundation of your intelligence.
Now, you might be thinking of attention as just, being polite and looking at whoever is talking. But biologically, it's so much more than that. Attention is the absolute foundation of learning, memory, decision-making, and your overall intelligence. Without sustained attention, your brain physically cannot efficiently process, understand, or store complex information. It's essentially the gateway to your mind. And right now, that gateway is under a massive coordinated siege.
So let's look at the actual science of attention, specifically inside the prefrontal cortex. In cognitive psychology, attention is generally broken down into 3 main types. You've got selective attention, which is your ability to focus while ignoring distractions, sustained attention, which is holding that focus over time, and divided attention, where you're trying to focus on multiple things at once. Managing all of this is your prefrontal cortex, or PFC. Think of the PFC as the CEO of your brain. It manages your executive function, the logical center responsible for planning, decision-making, and resisting distractions. It is literally the part of your brain actively fighting to keep you focused against a constant, relentless barrage of digital stimuli. Okay, you've probably heard that terrifying statistic that the human attention span has shrunk to 8 seconds, putting us below a literal goldfish. Well, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news, that goldfish statistic was entirely fabricated. There is absolutely zero peer-reviewed science supporting it. But the bad news? The actual empirical data is still incredibly concerning. According to informatics research by Dr. Gloria Mark, the average attention span on a single screen has plummeted from 2.5 minutes back in 2004 to a mere 47 seconds today. Yes, 47 seconds. Half of all our screen interactions now last less than 40 seconds before we switch to something else. Which brings us to the multitasking myth and the actual arithmetic of cognitive cost.
We all think we're amazing at multitasking, right? It's a massive misconception. The human brain is biologically incapable of true multitasking when it comes to complex thoughts. When you switch from writing an essay to checking a notification, your visual spotlight shifts in a fraction of a second, for sure. But your deeper cognitive architecture, that takes way longer. Every single interruption forces your brain to dump its current working memory and execute a high-energy context reload. So you are not multitasking. You are performing rapid, energy-depleting task switching. And this switching process creates what Dr. Sophie Leroy calls attention residue. Because human minds struggle to deactivate open cognitive loops, something called the Zeigarnik effect, when you switch away from an app and go back to your homework, your brain doesn't just switch instantly. A portion of your working memory actually remains anchored to that previous digital task, subconsciously tracking the social feed. You are physically leaving a piece of your cognitive bandwidth behind.
So what is the actual mathematical cost of this? It's 23 minutes. Research shows that after a single, seemingly harmless interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds for the brain to fully recover and return to its original baseline of deep focus. Think about what that means. If you're a student who checks your phone every 10 or 15 minutes while studying, your inner arrival time of interruptions is actually shorter than your cognitive recovery timeline, meaning you literally never reach full cognitive capacity, ever.
Let's move on to the brain drain effect and what researchers call the proximity toll.
Now, what if you don't actually check your phone? What if you are exceptionally disciplined? Incredibly, the mere physical presence of a device actively sabotages your focus. A landmark 2017 study by Ward and his colleagues actually measured available working memory in students. They found that even if a smartphone is completely silenced and placed face down on a desk, it actively drains intelligence compared to a phone left in another room. Why? Because it's a portal to infinite social rewards. Your prefrontal cortex has to actively burn its limited cognitive energy just to suppress the automatic urge to check it. And if that phone so much as buzzes, the cost skyrockets. Research utilizing the SART Commission, which measures sustained attention, completely disproved the idea that you can just ignore a notification.
Passively trying to ignore a visual pop-up, a ringtone, or even a silent vibration triggers task-irrelevant thoughts that persist long after the alert ends. In fact, receiving an alert and ignoring it increases cognitive errors threefold. The impairment is statistically equivalent to actively driving while distracted or missing a full night of sleep. That is wild.
So how does this play out in education? Let's look at the academic cost. Deep learning versus constant novelty.
This constant cognitive drain we just talked about fundamentally breaks the entire study process. Deep learning, things like encoding complex information, revising, and consolidating long-term memories, requires slow, uninterrupted, sustained attention. But social media platforms, they actively train the brain's reward system to expect a massive dopamine hit of constant novelty every 15 seconds. You're basically pitting high-effort, slow-reward academic work against low-effort, immediate reward algorithms. It's not a fair fight.
This brings us to a fascinating concept called the screen inferiority effect. Let's compare print versus pixels. This cognitive clash is highly visible in how we read. Meta-analyses of over 50 independent studies have documented this screen inferiority effect, showing that reading on digital screens systematically degrades our comprehension. But why? Well, when you read a physical textbook, your brain doesn't just process abstract data. It creates a literal spatial map. The tactile feedback, the static position of a sentence on the page, these are spatial haptic landmarks that anchor your memories. Digital scrolling completely destroys this. The continuous dynamic motion forces your visual system to constantly track moving text. It induces cognitive overload and forces the brain into a state of shallow digital skimming. And here is the real trap: metacognitive overconfidence. Because we are so used to rapidly skimming screens for high salience keywords, using what's known as an F-pattern scan, we transfer this shallow habit right over to our academic reading. And students suffer from a severe psychological miscalibration. They read the digital text faster, sure, but they falsely overestimate their level of comprehension. They predict they'll score much higher on tests than they actually do, simply because the feeling of swiping on a screen is just so familiar. Over time, this chronic exposure to rapid, short-form content biologically degrades our patience. Success in almost all complex tasks requires delayed gratification, but the brain, awash in the constant dopamine hits of this digital casino, shifts its preference heavily toward immediate stimulation. Watching a 15-second video requires virtually zero cognitive effort, while reading a challenging textbook chapter requires immense effort. Because the brain is physically adapting to expect constant, frictionless rewards, concentration during studying begins to feel incredibly, almost painfully, difficult. We're facing a landscape where human attention is treated as a scarce, extractable resource. Think about it. These platforms are designed with hyper-advanced algorithms and millisecond-level behavioral tracking to totally bypass your conscious, top-down filters and capture your attention automatically. The attention economy is a war for your mind. You are either the user or the product. It's a systematic fragmentation of our minds, completely by design. At first, we believed social media only stole our time. Then we discovered it was changing our attention. But perhaps its greatest hidden cost isn't measured in hours lost. It's measured in the nights we stay awake, the memories that never fully form, and the minds that never get the rest they need. In Part 4, we'll uncover how social media quietly disrupts sleep, mental health, and the brain's ability to recover itself.